In 1839, the London Cemetery Company opened Highgate Cemetery on 17 acres of sloping terrain in Highgate Village, North London. The facility was not a municipal graveyard, it was a private commercial enterprise, designed and operated under a specific economic model that had emerged in response to urban burial crisis. By the 1830s, inner London's parish churchyards had reached critical capacity. Overcrowding, shallow burials, and sanitation concerns had created public health hazards documented in parliamentary inquiries. The solution adopted was not public intervention but private capital. The cemetery companies operated under parliamentary acts that granted them legal authority to acquire land, establish burial grounds, and charge fees in perpetuity. Highgate's design reflected the prevailing philosophy of the garden cemetery movement. The landscape was engineered as a commercial product marketed to middle and upper-class families seeking permanent memorial space in aesthetically refined surroundings. The site incorporated architectural infrastructure uncommon in traditional churchyards: Egyptian Avenue, a sunken stone passage lined with family vaults, the Circle of Lebanon, a ring of catacombs surrounding a centuries-old cedar tree, the terrace catacombs, built into the hillside with individual burial chambers accessible through arched entrances. These were not decorative elements, they were revenue-generating assets. Each vault, each catacomb niche, each plot represented a capital sale with associated perpetual maintenance obligations. The operational model rested on three foundational assumptions. First, demand for burial space would remain consistent across generations, ensuring continuous plot sales. Second, the revenue from new sales combined with annual maintenance fees collected from plot holders would generate sufficient income to fund groundskeeping, structural maintenance, and administrative overhead indefinitely. Third, the legal framework ownership vested in a commercial company with fiduciary responsibility to shareholders and plot holders would ensure institutional continuity regardless of external economic or political changes. This model functioned as designed for approximately 70 years. Plot sales generated capital. Maintenance fees provided operational funding. The cemetery expanded. The West Cemetery, opened in 1839, was followed by the East Cemetery across Swains Lane in 1854. The company employed gardeners, grave diggers, administrative staff, and security personnel. Structural maintenance occurred on predictable cycles. Pathways remained clear. Vaults remained sealed. The system exhibited the stability its designers intended. The underlying engineering of this stability, however, was not infrastructural. It was financial. The cemetery's physical infrastructure, the masonry vaults, the drainage systems, the retaining walls, the iron gates required continuous expenditure to prevent deterioration. Stone erodes. Mortar fails. Metal corrodes. Drainage systems clog. Vegetation encroaches. These processes are not contingent on usage patterns or catastrophic events. They are constant, predictable, and inexorable. The only variable is whether sufficient resources are allocated to counteract them. The cemetery's resource allocation mechanism was entirely dependent on revenue flow, which was itself dependent on plot availability. The model contained no provision for the scenario in which demand persisted but supply available. Burial space approached exhaustion. A finite land area can accommodate only a finite number of burials. Once saturation is reached, plot sales revenue terminates. The model assumed that maintenance fees from existing plot holders would sustain operations after sales ceased. This assumption required that maintenance fees be set at levels sufficient to cover perpetual operational costs, and that collection mechanisms remain enforceable across generational transfers of ownership. Neither condition proved durable. Maintenance fees were established at rates considered reasonable in the mid-19th century, when labor costs, material costs, and administrative overhead reflected Victorian economic conditions. These costs did not remain static. Inflation, wage increases, material price volatility, and regulatory compliance costs introduced structural cost growth that fixed-rate maintenance fees could not absorb. The cemetery company had no mechanism to adjust fees unilaterally. Fee increases required plot holder consent, contractual renegotiation, or legal action processes that became increasingly complex as ownership fragmented across descendants, executors, and institutional holders. Enforcement mechanisms eroded in parallel. When the original plot purchaser died, responsibility for maintenance fees transferred to heirs or estate executors. Tracking these transfers required meticulous record-keeping and legal infrastructure. As decades passed and ownership dispersed across multiple generations, many plot holders became untraceable. Others disputed liability. Some refused payment. The company's ability to compel compliance depended on legal recourse, which required expenditure the company could not sustain if fee collection was already insufficient. The system entered a feedback loop. Declining revenue reduced enforcement capacity, which further reduced revenue. The design premised financial self-sufficiency through perpetual fee income assumed institutional immortality. The London Cemetery Company was a joint stock corporation, legally distinct from its shareholders. Corporate structures provide continuity independent of individual mortality. But corporations are not invulnerable to insolvency. If liabilities exceed assets, or if operational costs exceed revenue, corporate dissolution becomes inevitable. The cemetery's physical infrastructure constituted a massive illiquid asset with negative cash flow once plot sales ceased. The company owned land and structures that required continuous expenditure but generated declining income. This contradiction was not immediately visible. The cemetery did not fail suddenly, it degraded incrementally. Maintenance intervals lengthened, staff reductions occurred. Grounds care shifted from proactive landscaping to reactive crisis response. Structural repairs were deferred. Security patrols decreased. Each cost reduction was individually justifiable as a response to budget constraints. Cumulatively, they initiated physical decay that would accelerate non-linearly. The informational architecture available to company management did not provide early warning of systemic failure. Financial statements reported current revenue and expenditure. They did not model the net present value of perpetual maintenance obligations against realistic projections of fee collection rates across multi-generational timescales. The company operated quarter to quarter, year to year, responding to immediate budget gaps rather than engaging with the structural impossibility of the model under conditions of plot saturation and fee erosion. The regulatory environment provided no corrective mechanism. Cemetery companies operated under their founding parliamentary acts, which established governance structures and operational authorities but imposed minimal ongoing oversight. No regulatory body monitored financial sustainability. No authority had the mandate to intervene in private company operations to prevent infrastructure failure. Public funding mechanisms, municipal budgets, heritage grants, public works appropriations did not extend to private commercial burial grounds. The cemetery was legally private property, and its deterioration was a private concern unless and until it created a public hazard. The design assumption that became invalid under real-world conditions was not a technical specification. It was an economic projection embedded in the business model itself. The cemetery was designed as a perpetual care landscape, financed by a revenue stream that could not, by geometric necessity, be perpetual. The infrastructure required indefinite maintenance. The funding model required indefinite sales. These requirements were mathematically incompatible. The failure was not a consequence of poor management, unforeseen events, or external shocks. It was a deterministic outcome of the model's internal logic once the finite resource burial space approached depletion. By the early 20th century, the structural contradictions had begun to manifest physically. Sections of the West Cemetery showed visible neglect. Vegetation overgrowth obscured pathways. Minor vandalism went unrepaired. The company continued to operate, but the operational capacity to maintain the entire site to original standards had eroded. The East Cemetery, being newer and still generating sales, received priority. The West Cemetery began a slow, irreversible transition from maintained landscape to derelict infrastructure. The system's information structure prevented stakeholders from recognizing the inevitability of collapse. Plot holders observed localized deterioration but had no visibility into the company's financial position or long-term sustainability. Company management responded to immediate crises but had no framework to address the structural funding gap. Regulators had no mandate to intervene. The public perceived cemetery neglect as an aesthetic or cultural issue, not as an infrastructure failure with systemic causes. Each stakeholder group operated within its own informational silo, unable to perceive the system-level trajectory. The vulnerability that would later enable complete institutional collapse was already present in the design phase. The cemetery was engineered to function as a self-sustaining entity, but self-sustaining was defined solely in terms of cash flow under ideal conditions: continuous demand, reliable fee collection, stable costs, corporate perpetuity. No redundancy existed. No alternative funding mechanism was specified. No contingency planning addressed the scenario in which any single assumption failed. The system had a single point of failure: revenue adequacy. When that failed, no fallback existed. This was not a failure of foresight in the ordinary sense. Victorian cemetery designers and company founders understood mortality, inheritance, and corporate finance. What they did not and could not anticipate was the century-long trajectory of social, economic, and regulatory evolution that would systematically invalidate each assumption underpinning the model. Cremation, introduced in the late 19th century, reduced demand for burial plots. Suburbanization shifted population centers, making inner London cemeteries less desirable. Changing attitudes toward death and memorialization reduced the cultural value placed on elaborate burial infrastructure. Each trend was individually modest. Cumulatively, they dismantled the demand assumptions on which the model depended. The cemetery, as built, was a physical manifestation of a specific moment's economic logic. It could not adapt. Its infrastructure was fixed, designed for perpetual use under a specific operational model. When that model became economically non-viable, the infrastructure itself became a liability, an asset requiring perpetual expenditure with no mechanism to generate the resources that expenditure required. The failure chain was embedded in the design itself, waiting only for time and changing conditions to make it manifest. The structural vulnerabilities embedded in Highgate Cemetery's design existed in latent form for decades before manifesting as visible failure. These vulnerabilities were not hidden defects. They were documented, known characteristics of the operational model that appeared manageable under normal conditions. The transition from manageable constraint to systemic crisis required specific triggering conditions, but those conditions were not anomalous. They were predictable developments in British social, economic, and regulatory evolution that the cemetery's institutional framework was not designed to accommodate. The first latent condition was the legal structure governing cemetery company operations. The London Cemetery Company operated under the Highgate Cemetery Act of 1836, a private parliamentary act that granted the company authority to establish and operate burial grounds in perpetuity. This legal framework established governance structures, defined property rights, and specified operational authorities. What it did not establish was any mechanism for regulatory oversight, financial auditing, or compulsory intervention in the event of institutional failure. The Act created a legally isolated entity with minimal external accountability. This isolation was intentional. Victorian cemetery companies were private commercial ventures, and the prevailing regulatory philosophy emphasized minimal state intervention in private enterprise. The company's fiduciary responsibilities were to its shareholders and implicitly to plot holders who had purchased burial rights. But these responsibilities were not enforceable by external authority unless specific legal violations occurred. Poor financial management, inadequate maintenance, or gradual infrastructure deterioration did not constitute actionable violations. They were internal company matters. The absence of oversight created an informational void. No regulatory body tracked the cemetery's financial health. No authority audited maintenance expenditures against infrastructure requirements. No external entity had the mandate or the data to assess whether the perpetual care model was functioning as designed. The company's annual reports, submitted to shareholders, provided financial summaries but not long-term sustainability analyses. Shareholders received dividends when profits allowed and were informed of deficits when they occurred, but they had no framework to evaluate whether those deficits represented temporary fluctuations or structural insolvency. Plot holders had even less visibility. Their relationship with the cemetery was contractual. They had purchased specific burial rights and held legal title to those rights, but they had no ownership stake in the company itself and no access to operational or financial information. If maintenance quality declined, their recourse was limited to complaints or, in extreme cases, legal action for breach of contract. But pursuing legal action required resources, coordination among multiple plot holders, and evidence that contractual obligations had been violated. Gradual deterioration deferred, maintenance, reduced groundskeeping frequency, minor vandalism going unrepaired, did not constitute clear breach. It was a gray zone where company obligations were being technically met, but at progressively lower standards. The second latent condition was the fragmentation of plot ownership across time. When a plot was originally purchased, ownership was typically vested in a single individual or family. That owner had direct interest in maintaining the site and direct relationship with the cemetery company. Upon the owner's death, responsibility transferred to heirs or executors. If the family line continued and descendants maintained interest in the gravesite, this transfer preserved the relationship. But many families did not maintain continuity. Descendants emigrated, lost interest, or simply failed to maintain records of burial plot ownership across generations. The cemetery company's record-keeping systems were designed for the administrative requirements of the 19th century. Records were maintained in ledgers, organized by plot number and original purchaser name. Tracking ownership transfers across multiple generations required meticulous updating, which depended on families proactively informing the company of changes. Many did not. The company had no independent mechanism to verify current ownership. As decades passed, the proportion of plots with untraceable or disputed ownership increased. These plots still required maintenance, but the associated fee revenue could not be collected. The company's response to non-payment evolved over time in ways that further eroded financial sustainability. Initially, the company pursued collection aggressively, employing solicitors to trace heirs and enforce payment. This approach was resource-intensive and often unsuccessful. Legal costs frequently exceeded the fees recovered. By the early 20th century, the company had largely abandoned aggressive collection efforts. Plots with non-paying or untraceable owners were simply maintained at company expense, funded by the diminishing revenue from paying plot holders and new sales. This created a cross-subsidy dynamic that accelerated financial deterioration. Paying plot holders were, in effect, subsidizing maintenance of abandoned plots. As the ratio of non-paying to paying plots increased, the per-plot burden on paying families rose. This, in turn, incentivized more families to cease payment, particularly those with weakening emotional or familial connection to the burial site. The feedback loop was self-reinforcing. Rising costs led to more non-payment, which increased costs for remaining payers, which led to further attrition. The third latent condition was the absence of adaptive capacity in the operational model. The cemetery's infrastructure and staffing were designed for a specific operational tempo: continuous new burials, regular grounds maintenance, periodic structural repairs, and administrative processing of plot transactions. This model assumed relatively stable workload distribution over time. It did not account for the possibility that workload composition might shift fundamentally from active burial operations to pure maintenance of a fixed, saturated site. When burial space approached saturation, the operational requirements did not decrease, they intensified. A fully utilized cemetery contains the maximum possible density of structures requiring maintenance, vaults, headstones, pathways, drainage systems, landscaping. The physical labor required to maintain a saturated site exceeds that required to maintain a partially filled one. Simultaneously, the revenue generated by that site, now dependent entirely on maintenance fees rather than plot sales, declined in real terms due to inflation, non-payment, and fee stagnation. The company's staffing model could not adapt to this inversion. Reducing staff reduced maintenance capacity, which accelerated physical deterioration, which increased the backlog of required repairs, which required more staff. Maintaining staff levels required revenue the company no longer generated. The company was trapped between incompatible imperatives, infrastructure obligations that required stable or increasing resources, and financial reality that provided only declining resources. The fourth latent condition was the vulnerability of the physical infrastructure itself to deferred maintenance. Cemetery structures were built to Victorian standards using materials and techniques common in the mid-19th century. Stone masonry, brick, wrought iron, and early Portland cement were durable under proper maintenance, but susceptible to accelerated decay if maintenance lapsed. Drainage systems required regular clearing to prevent water accumulation, which caused frost damage, subsidence, and vegetation intrusion. Metalwork required periodic treatment to prevent rust. Masonry required repointing as mortar degraded. These maintenance tasks were not discretionary, they were necessary to prevent nonlinear deterioration, the phenomenon where small initial damage creates conditions that accelerate subsequent damage. A blocked drain causes localized water pooling. Water infiltration weakens mortar. Weakened mortar allows vegetation roots to penetrate. Root growth fractures masonry. Fractured masonry creates larger water ingress points. The cycle accelerates. What begins as a minor maintenance lapse becomes structural failure requiring capital expenditure far exceeding the cost of preventive maintenance. The cemetery's maintenance protocols, established in the operational phase when revenue was adequate, prioritized preventive intervention. Regular inspections identified issues early. Repairs were scheduled before minor problems cascaded. This approach was cost-effective but required consistent funding. When funding became inadequate, the company shifted to reactive maintenance, addressing only failures that created immediate hazard or visibility problems. This shift was economically rational in the short term, but catastrophic in aggregate. Deferred maintenance accumulated as a hidden liability. The physical infrastructure was degrading faster than visible symptoms suggested. The fifth latent condition was the informational asymmetry between different stakeholder groups regarding the cemetery's true condition. Company management had direct visibility into financial distress, declining revenue, rising costs, deferred maintenance backlogs, but limited incentive to publicize this information. Shareholders received financial summaries indicating difficulty but not projections of insolvency. Plot holders observed localized deterioration but had no access to system-level data. Regulatory authorities, had they existed, would have required investigative resources to audit conditions across the entire site. This informational fragmentation prevented coordinated response. Each stakeholder group operated within its own knowledge domain, responding to the signals available to them. Management made incremental cost reductions. Shareholders tolerated reduced dividends. Plot holders complained about specific issues. No single entity had both the comprehensive information and the authority to recognize and address the systemic trajectory toward institutional collapse. The sixth latent condition was cultural and institutional inertia. The cemetery had operated for decades. Its existence was taken for granted by families, local community, and municipal authorities. The assumption that it would continue to exist and function was embedded in estate planning, family traditions, and local identity. This assumption created complacency. When deterioration began, it was interpreted as temporary difficulty rather than structural failure. The company's assurances that financial challenges were being managed were accepted because the alternative, acknowledging that a century-old institution was approaching collapse, was psychologically and socially difficult. Human factors research identifies this pattern as normalization of deviance. When systems drift gradually from intended operational parameters, stakeholders adjust their expectations rather than recognizing the drift as evidence of systemic failure. Small deviations become accepted as the new normal. Standards erode incrementally. Each stage of deterioration is judged relative to the immediately preceding condition rather than to the original design intent. By the time deterioration becomes undeniable, the system has drifted so far from its design state that recovery requires resources far exceeding those that would have been needed for early intervention. The cemetery's operational staff experienced this normalization directly. Groundskeepers who had worked at the site for years watched maintenance standards decline. Tasks that had once been performed weekly became monthly, then quarterly, then deferred indefinitely. Equipment deteriorated without replacement. Vegetation management shifted from landscaping to minimal control of the most intrusive growth. Each worker adapted to the new reality, continuing to perform their duties as well as constrained resources allowed. But the collective result was a site that bore little resemblance to its designed condition. The seventh latent condition was the economic and social transition occurring in early 20th century Britain that fundamentally altered the cemetery's market position. Cremation, legalized in 1902, offered an alternative to traditional burial that was less expensive, required no ongoing plot maintenance, and aligned with changing attitudes toward death and memorialization. Adoption was initially slow but accelerated through the interwar period and post-World War II era. Each family choosing cremation represented lost burial plot revenue and, more significantly, lost perpetual maintenance fee income. Simultaneously, suburbanization shifted London's residential geography. The families who were the cemetery's primary market, middle and upper-middle-class Londoners, increasingly lived in outer suburbs or relocated entirely. The cultural connection to inner London burial grounds weakened. New cemeteries opened in suburban locations, closer to where families actually lived. Highgate's competitive position eroded not due to service failure, but due to geographic and cultural displacement. These trends were visible in burial statistics, which showed declining demand throughout the early 20th century. The cemetery company responded by reducing prices to maintain market share, which further compressed revenue margins. The company was trapped in a classic declining industry scenario: falling demand, excess capacity, price competition, and fixed costs. Standard business strategy in such scenarios involves either radical restructuring, market repositioning, or managed exit. The cemetery could pursue none of these options. Its infrastructure was fixed. Its obligations were perpetual. Exit was not legally possible without abandoning contractual commitments to plot holders. The eighth latent condition was the absence of any legal or financial mechanism to transfer cemetery operations to public or nonprofit stewardship before reaching insolvency. Victorian legal frameworks did not contemplate the scenario of cemetery company failure. No statutory process existed for converting a private cemetery to public ownership. Municipal authorities had no mandate or budget allocation for assuming responsibility for failing private cemeteries. Charitable organizations focused on heritage preservation had limited resources and typically engaged with nationally significant sites, not local cemeteries. This institutional void meant that when financial failure became inevitable, no orderly transition mechanism existed. The company could not be sold as a going concern because it had negative value; its liabilities exceeded its assets. It could not be voluntarily dissolved because dissolution would leave plot holders' contractual rights unenforceable and the physical site without legal ownership. It could not be compulsorily acquired by public authority because no statutory basis for such acquisition existed. The company was legally immortal but financially insolvent, condemned to continue operating below minimum standards until external intervention occurred through some other mechanism. The latent conditions identified here were not failures in the conventional sense. They were characteristics of the system as designed, operating within the legal, economic, and social context of their time. The London Cemetery Company was structured like other commercial enterprises of the Victorian era. Its operational practices reflected standard business methods. Its legal framework was typical of private cemetery companies. The informational asymmetries, ownership fragmentation, and lack of regulatory oversight were normal features of the institutional landscape. What made these conditions latent failures was not their existence, but their interaction under changing external conditions. The system was resilient within the parameter space. Its designers anticipated stable demand, enforceable fees, modest inflation, cultural continuity. It was fragile outside that space. When cremation, suburbanization, inflation, and social change altered the operating environment, the system had no adaptive capacity. The latent conditions, which had been invisible or irrelevant under favorable conditions, became the structural determinants of failure under unfavorable ones. The trap, from a human factors perspective, was that each stakeholder group made rational decisions based on the information available to them and the incentives they faced. Company management pursued cost reduction because revenue was inadequate. Shareholders tolerated reduced returns because liquidation offered no better alternative. Plot holders ceased payment because their emotional connection to distant ancestors' graves weakened and enforcement was unlikely. Regulatory authorities did not intervene because intervention was not legally mandated. Each decision was locally rational. Collectively, they formed a trajectory toward systemic collapse that no single actor had the information, authority, or incentive to prevent. The conditions under which a minor transient becomes unrecoverable, were now fully in place. The cemetery had reached plot saturation, terminating new sales revenue. Maintenance fee collection had eroded to a fraction of required levels. Physical infrastructure was deteriorating faster than reactive maintenance could address. The company's financial position was structurally insolvent. No external intervention mechanism existed, and critically, no stakeholder group had recognized that these conditions were not temporary difficulties but permanent features of a failed operational model. The system was not experiencing a crisis. It had transitioned into a new equilibrium state, managed decline with no recovery mechanism. The transition from latent vulnerability to manifest crisis did not occur through a single initiating event in the conventional sense. There was no sudden equipment failure, no catastrophic structural collapse, no discrete moment when the system state changed from functional to failed. Instead, the initiating event was a temporal threshold, the point at which available burial space reached effective saturation and new plot sales revenue declined to negligible levels. For Highgate Cemetery, this threshold was crossed gradually during the 1930s and 1940s, though precise dating is complicated by the disruption of World War II and the destruction of some company records during this period. By 1939, the West Cemetery was effectively full. The most desirable plots, those along main pathways, near prominent monuments, or in the architecturally significant structures like the Circle of Lebanon and Egyptian Avenue, had been sold decades earlier. Remaining available space consisted of less desirable locations, steep slopes, areas with poor drainage, sections distant from main access points. Sales of these marginal plots occurred sporadically and at reduced prices. The East Cemetery, opened 85 years after the West, still had some available space, but demand for burial plots in general was declining due to cremation adoption and changing social patterns. The financial reports available from this period, though incomplete, indicate a sharp decline in plot sale revenue beginning in the late 1930s. The company's income increasingly derived from maintenance fees rather than capital sales. This shift represented the realization of the structural contradiction embedded in the original design. The cemetery had been built to perpetual care standards using finite duration revenue. The moment plot sales revenue terminated, the financial model's internal logic failed. The company now faced perpetual obligations with a revenue stream that was both inadequate and actively declining due to non-payment and ownership attrition. World War II introduced additional stress factors that accelerated the divergence between operational requirements and available resources. Wartime labor shortages reduced cemetery staffing. Materials rationing limited availability of maintenance supplies. Blackout regulations and security concerns restricted evening access, which had previously been a significant component of visitation. Burial demand actually increased temporarily due to war casualties, but this was offset by broader economic disruption and the government's establishment of war grave programs that competed with private cemeteries. The company's response to these combined stresses was to implement systematic prioritization, a triage approach to resource allocation that concentrated limited maintenance capacity on the most visible and structurally critical areas, while allowing less visible sections to deteriorate unchecked. Main pathways were kept passable. High-profile monuments and vaults received minimal maintenance to prevent obvious collapse. Peripheral areas, sections with fewer visitors, and structurally sound but aesthetically degraded features were effectively abandoned to accelerated natural overgrowth. This prioritization created a spatial divergence within the cemetery itself. The portions that visitors typically saw entry areas, main paths, prominent monuments maintained a superficial appearance of order. This visible zone suggested that the cemetery, while perhaps understaffed, was still functionally maintained. But visitors who ventured into peripheral sections encountered a radically different condition: pathways overgrown to impassability, structures engulfed in vegetation, headstones toppled and obscured, drainage failures creating muddy, impassable zones. The cemetery had effectively bifurcated into a maintained facade and an abandoned interior. This spatial division created an informational problem identical in structure to the instrument indication problems that characterize technical system failures. The visible portion of the cemetery provided misleading evidence about the system's true state. Casual visitors, plot holders who visited only occasionally, and external observers who judged condition based on accessible areas, received signals indicating managed decline but not systemic failure. They saw a cemetery that was somewhat neglected but still recognizably functioning as a cemetery. The hidden deterioration in inaccessible sections was not visible to these stakeholders and therefore did not influence their assessment of the situation. Company management understood the true extent of deterioration because they had access to comprehensive site knowledge, but they had strong incentives not to communicate this information transparently. Acknowledging the extent of failure would alarm plot holders, potentially triggering legal action or demands for remediation the company could not afford. It would alarm shareholders, potentially triggering a crisis of confidence that would make capital raising impossible. It would attract regulatory attention and possible media scrutiny. The rational response from management's perspective was to minimize public acknowledgement of the crisis while continuing to manage decline as best as limited resources allowed. The divergence between physical reality and stakeholder perception widened through the 1950s and 1960s. The post-war period brought economic recovery and rising living standards to Britain generally, but the cemetery company did not participate in this recovery. The structural problems, plot saturation, fee erosion, deferred maintenance backlog, were not amenable to solution through general economic growth. The company needed either a fundamental restructuring of its financial model or external intervention. Neither occurred. During this period, cremation adoption accelerated dramatically. By 1968, cremation accounted for more than 50% of disposals in Britain, rising to over 70% by the late 1970s. Each percentage point increase in cremation rate represented a permanent reduction in demand for burial plots and, critically, a reduction in the number of families entering into perpetual maintenance fee relationships. The cemetery's future revenue base was not merely stagnant, it was contracting in absolute terms as the proportion of the population choosing burial decreased. The company's operational indicators during this period, such as they were, showed what appeared to be stable if constrained operations. Burials continued, though at declining rates. Maintenance activities continued, though at reduced frequency. Administrative functions continued. The company was still sending invoices for maintenance fees, still responding to plot holder inquiries, still conducting interments. From a procedural perspective, the company was following its established operational patterns. These patterns were designed for normal operation, and the company continued executing them even as the underlying conditions made those patterns increasingly inadequate. This is the precise structural analog of the operator trap in technical system failures. Procedures designed for one set of conditions continue to be followed under radically different conditions where they are no longer appropriate. The cemetery company was executing a maintenance protocol designed for a financially solvent organization with adequate staffing and resources. Continuing to follow this protocol under resource-constrained conditions created an illusion of normalcy while the physical plant deteriorated progressively further from design standards. The first clear external indication that the cemetery had transitioned from constrained operation to institutional failure emerged not from the cemetery itself, but from secondary effects becoming visible to outside observers. Vandalism, which had been a minor intermittent problem, increased significantly in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The vandalism was not random mischief. It targeted the sections of the cemetery that were most deteriorated and therefore most accessible to unauthorized entry. Broken or missing gates, overgrown perimeter fencing, and collapsed sections of boundary walls created entry points. The lack of staff presence and security patrols created an environment where vandalism could occur without immediate detection. The vandalism itself created a feedback mechanism that accelerated decline. Damaged monuments and structures required repair to prevent further deterioration. The company lacked resources to perform these repairs. Unrepaired damage signaled abandonment, which invited further vandalism and increasingly more serious criminal activity. By the early 1970s, sections of Highgate had become informal gathering places for activities that ranged from adolescent trespassing to more organized exploitation, including theft of lead coffin linings and metal fixtures, which had scrap value. Media coverage of vandalism at Highgate introduced the cemetery to public consciousness in a way that fundamentally altered its cultural position. Prior to this coverage, Highgate was known primarily to local residents and families with burial connections. The vandalism incidents, particularly those involving desecration of graves and damage to historically significant monuments, attracted regional and then national media attention. The coverage framed Highgate as a site of Gothic decay and supernatural folklore, rather than as a failing business infrastructure. This reframing had contradictory effects. On one hand, it attracted public attention and some expressions of concern about heritage preservation. On the other hand, it attracted a different kind of visitor, individuals interested in ruins, dark tourism, and the macabre aesthetic of abandonment. The cemetery became a destination for informal exploration, ghost hunting, and photography of decay. This unofficial use accelerated physical damage through foot traffic in structurally compromised areas and created additional security burdens the company could not address. The company's informational position during this period was characterized by knowledge of comprehensive failure, combined with inability to communicate that knowledge effectively to stakeholders who might have intervened. Management knew that the physical infrastructure was deteriorating toward irreversible damage. They knew that financial resources were inadequate to reverse this trajectory. They knew that, without external intervention, collapse was inevitable. But communicating this reality required admitting institutional failure in ways that would trigger immediate legal and financial consequences the company was not prepared to face. This created a perverse incentive structure, where the rational short-term action was continued operation at declining standards, rather than public acknowledgement of crisis. Each month of continued operation, however degraded, postponed the legal and financial reckoning that comprehensive failure would trigger. Management was not engaged in denial. They were engaged in rational crisis management given the constraints they faced. But the cumulative effect of these month-by-month decisions was progressive deepening of the deterioration, making eventual recovery more difficult and more expensive. The physical evidence from this period, reconstructed from photographic documentation and later site surveys, shows systematic progression of specific failure modes. Vegetation overgrowth, initially a landscaping problem, had transitioned to a structural threat. Tree roots penetrated masonry vaults, causing internal collapse. Ivy and other climbing plants covered monuments to the extent that inscriptions became illegible. Unchecked vegetation growth in drainage channels caused water backup, leading to subsidence and pathway collapse in multiple locations. The Circle of Lebanon, one of the cemetery's most architecturally significant structures, showed evidence of water damage and structural movement due to root penetration and drainage failure. Metal structures, gates, railings, roof elements on mausolea showed advanced corrosion. Wrought iron, which is relatively resistant to atmospheric corrosion when properly maintained, degrades rapidly once protective coatings fail and the metal is exposed to moisture. The cemetery's metal structures had not received protective treatment in decades. Surface rust had progressed to structural loss. Gates sagged on corroded hinges. Railings exhibited fractures where corrosion had reduced cross-sectional area beyond load-bearing capacity. Roof elements on some structures had failed completely, exposing interior spaces to weather. Masonry deterioration followed predictable patterns. Mortar joints, exposed to freeze-thaw cycles without repointing, exhibited progressive failure. Bricks and stone blocks no longer held securely became loose and fell, creating gaps that accelerated water penetration. In some vaults, entire sections of wall had collapsed, exposing coffins to the elements. The structural integrity of terraced and underground catacomb systems was compromised by water infiltration and loss of mortar cohesion. The divergence between what the cemetery's condition indicated to different observer groups reached its maximum extent during this period. To families visiting specific graves in maintained sections, the cemetery appeared neglected, but still recognizably a cemetery. The paths were overgrown but passable. The monuments were weathered but standing. The general character of the landscape was intact. To explorers and photographers accessing the deteriorated sections, the cemetery appeared comprehensively abandoned structures in collapse, vegetation engulfing monuments, coffins visible through failed masonry, the site appearing more like a ruins than a functioning burial ground. to company management, viewing the site through comprehensive knowledge of deterioration extent and financial inability to address it. The cemetery appeared as a failing infrastructure system approaching terminal collapse. To municipal authorities and heritage organizations, who had received complaints and media inquiries, but had no direct operational knowledge or legal responsibility, the cemetery appeared as a concerning situation requiring monitoring, but not yet triggering intervention. These divergent perceptions prevented coordinated response. Each stakeholder group responded to the version of reality visible to them. Families complained about specific local conditions. Media reported on dramatic visual deterioration and vandalism incidents. Management continued minimalist operations. Authorities monitored the situation. No single action or decision could resolve the underlying structural impossibility, a physical infrastructure requiring perpetual significant expenditure, supported by a financial model that had irreversibly failed, governed by a legal framework that provided no mechanism for orderly transition to alternative stewardship. The decision forked the point where different interpretations of system state could lead to radically different actions had effectively been reached. But unlike technical system failures, where operators must choose between competing instrument readings or procedural paths under time pressure, the cemetery's decision fork was temporally distributed across years and involved multiple independent stakeholder groups with no coordination mechanism. The decision was made through accumulated inaction, rather than deliberate choice. Each month that passed without intervention was an implicit decision to allow deterioration to continue. By the mid-1970s, the cemetery had transitioned from a failing business to a heritage emergency. The physical condition had degraded to the point where further deterioration would cause irreversible loss of historically and architecturally significant structures. The graves of notable individuals, including Karl Marx, whose monument had become a pilgrimage site for political visitors, were at risk. The site as a whole represented a significant example of Victorian cemetery design and landscape architecture. Its loss would constitute elimination of a non-replaceable cultural asset. The system state at this juncture was unambiguous in physical terms: comprehensive deterioration, accelerating damage, and absence of any mechanism within the existing institutional structure to arrest the decline. But this physical clarity did not translate into institutional clarity about what action to take, who had authority to take it, or how to fund it. The divergence was no longer between indicator and reality. The indicators now clearly showed failure. The divergence was between physical necessity and institutional capacity. The physical deterioration of Highgate Cemetery between the 1950s and mid to 1970s was not a singular collapse but a cascade of interdependent failure mechanisms, each creating conditions that accelerated subsequent failures. Understanding this cascade requires examining the material physics of cemetery infrastructure and the specific ways that deferred maintenance initiates non-linear degradation processes. Unlike engineered systems with well-defined failure modes and predictable time-to-failure metrics, cemetery infrastructure fails through biological, chemical, and mechanical processes, operating simultaneously across distributed components with highly variable material properties and environmental exposures. The primary failure mechanism was vegetation encroachment and its structural consequences. Victorian cemetery design incorporated extensive landscaping trees, shrubs, ground cover as aesthetic elements, integral to the garden cemetery concept. This vegetation required continuous management to prevent overgrowth. Trees planted in the 1840s and 1850s had reached full maturity by the early 20th century. Without active management, these trees functioned not as landscape elements, but as structural threats to nearby monuments and underground vaults. Tree root systems, particularly those of species like cedars, yews, and sycamores common in Victorian cemetery planting, extend radially from the trunk seeking water and nutrients. The root systems do not recognize property boundaries or respect structural integrity. When a root encounters an obstacle, a brick vault wall, a stone foundation, a concrete pathway, the root does not stop. It exploits any available gap or weakness. Mortar joints in masonry, drainage holes in foundations, and cracks in concrete provide initial penetration points. Once established, root growth exerts continuous lateral pressure. This pressure is substantial. A growing root can generate forces exceeding several hundred pounds per square inch. Masonry structures, while compressively strong, have limited tensile strength and virtually no capacity to resist sustained lateral pressure from within. A root penetrating a mortar joint causes progressive displacement of the surrounding masonry. The joint widens, adjacent mortar fails, the structure develops a crack, water enters the crack, freeze-thaw cycles expand the crack. The root system expands into the widened gap, the feedback loop accelerates. What begins as millimeter-scale penetration progresses over years to structural displacement measured in centimeters, then to partial wall failure, then to comprehensive collapse. The Circle of Lebanon exemplifies this failure mode. The structure consists of a circular ring of underground catacombs surrounding the base of a cedar tree, specifically a cedar of Lebanon that was already mature when the cemetery was designed in the 1830s. The tree, estimated to be over 300 years old by the 1970s, had a root system extending tens of meters in all directions. The catacomb walls, built in the 1830s and 1840s, were designed to accommodate the tree's existing root structure, but not to resist expansion over subsequent decades. By the 1960s, root growth had caused visible displacement of masonry in multiple catacomb chambers. Cracks had propagated through walls. In several chambers, partial collapse had occurred, exposing coffins and human remains. The company's maintenance records from the 1950s, fragmentary but extant, document awareness of this problem. Notations indicate that specific catacomb chambers were unsafe for access and that root damage was progressive and requiring attention. But the remediation required selective root pruning without killing the tree, structural reinforcement of displaced masonry, installation of root barriers, and repointing of all affected joints represented capital expenditure far beyond the company's financial capacity. The rational response, given resource constraints, was to restrict access to affected areas and monitor for immediate collapse hazards. This response prevented acute casualties but did not arrest the underlying deterioration. The second major failure mechanism was water-related damage operating through multiple coupled processes. Cemetery infrastructure in sloped terrain like Highgate's depends critically on functional drainage systems to prevent water accumulation. The site's natural topography causes surface water and groundwater to flow downslope. Without engineered drainage, this water would saturate soil, cause erosion, and create subsidence. The cemetery's original design incorporated surface drainage channels, subsurface drains, and collection systems to manage water flow. These drainage systems required regular maintenance, clearing of debris, vegetation management, periodic inspection, and repair of damaged sections. When maintenance lapsed, vegetation growth blocked drainage channels. Leaves, organic debris, and soil accumulation created dams. Water that should have been channeled away instead ponded behind these blockages. The ponded water followed the path of least resistance, which frequently meant infiltrating underground structures, vaults, catacombs, and coffin chambers. Water infiltration into underground burial chambers created multiple deterioration mechanisms simultaneously. First, the presence of liquid water in contact with coffin materials typically leads sheeting over wood for wealthier burials, or wood alone for modest burials initiated corrosion and decay. Lead, while highly resistant to atmospheric corrosion, is vulnerable to certain soil chemistry conditions. The organic acids produced by decomposition of coffin contents and wooden coffin materials create an acidic microenvironment that accelerates lead corrosion. Once the lead sheeting is perforated, water enters the coffin itself. Second, water presence in confined underground spaces creates conditions for biological colonization. Fungi, bacteria, and algae establish themselves. Organic material, wood, fabric, leather, human tissue in various states of preservation, provides nutrient sources. The biological activity accelerates material breakdown. Wood rots, fabric disintegrates. The structural integrity of coffin assemblies fails. Coffins that were stacked or shelved in catacomb niches collapse onto lower coffins, creating progressive cascade failures within vault structures. Third, water in underground chambers creates freeze-thaw cycle damage to the masonry structures themselves. Water infiltrating masonry expands upon freezing. This expansion generates internal stress that exceeds the tensile strength of the mortar, and in some cases the stone or brick itself. Repeated freeze-thaw cycles create progressive spalling surface material flakes off, exposing fresh surface to further water penetration. Mortar joints fail from the interior outward. Masonry elements lose cohesion and shift position. The Egyptian avenue structure demonstrates the cascading nature of water-related damage. This sunken passage, lined with stone facades designed to evoke Egyptian temple architecture, functions as a water collection channel during heavy rainfall if surface drainage above the structure is inadequate. By the 1960s, surface drainage maintenance had essentially ceased in this area. During rain events, water flowed down the slope and accumulated in the sunken avenue. The stone facades showed extensive water staining. Mortar joints exhibited loss of material. In several locations, the facade stones had shifted outward from the backing masonry, indicating that water pressure behind the facade was causing structural displacement. Interior inspection of family vaults accessible from the Egyptian avenue revealed standing water in multiple chambers. The water depth varied seasonally higher during winter wet periods, lower during summer, but never fully drained. This permanent water presence indicated that the subsurface drainage system serving these vaults had failed completely. The vaults, designed as dry chambers, had transitioned to functioning as unintentional wells, collecting groundwater and surface infiltration with no outlet. The consequence for burial contents was severe. Coffins in these flooded vaults exhibited comprehensive material failure. Lead coffins showed perforation and collapse. Wooden coffins had disintegrated. In some chambers, human skeletal remains were visible in the water, completely disarticulated, from their original burial configuration. From a public health and dignity perspective, this represented complete failure of the cemetery's core function: secure, permanent interment. The third major failure mechanism was vandalism acting as an accelerant on existing deterioration. Vandalism at Highgate occurred in waves, with intensity increasing as visible deterioration increased, and security presence decreased. The vandalism was not uniformly distributed. It concentrated in areas that were already deteriorated, and therefore more accessible and less likely to be observed by staff or other visitors. The vandalism itself took several forms, each with distinct material consequences. Monument toppling, the deliberate pushing over of upright headstones and statuary, caused immediate visible damage but relatively limited long-term structural consequence. A toppled monument lying on the ground deteriorates more slowly than one standing upright and exposed to weather. The primary consequence was aesthetic and cultural rather than structural. Theft of metal elements had more serious structural implications. Lead sheeting, iron railings, copper roof elements, and bronze memorial plaques all had scrap value. Removal of these elements created immediate weatherproofing failures. A vault with an intact lead-lined roof remains dry. The same vault with the lead removed becomes an open chamber exposed to direct rainfall. The rate of interior deterioration increases by orders of magnitude. Water that would have been shed off the surface now enters the structure directly, overwhelming any residual drainage capacity, and creating the conditions for the water damage mechanisms previously described. Break-in vandalism, the forced entry into sealed vaults and tombs, created human remains exposure that triggered public health concerns and intensified media coverage. From a structural perspective, these break-ins often involved removing or damaging closure elements, iron doors, stone seals, masonry panels that were integral to the structure's weatherproofing. Once breached, these structures experienced accelerated interior deterioration. Additionally, open vaults created access points for animals, particularly foxes, which established dens in some structures and caused secondary disturbance of burial remains. The feedback relationship between deterioration and vandalism was critical to understanding the failure chain's acceleration. Initial vandalism occurred despite the cemetery's condition. Subsequent vandalism occurred because of the cemetery's condition. Visible abandonment signaled low risk of detection. Structural deterioration created easier physical access. Each vandalism incident created damage that the company could not repair, which further signaled abandonment, which invited more vandalism. The cycle was self-reinforcing and accelerating. The fourth major failure mechanism was loss of material records and institutional knowledge. The cemetery company's operational continuity had been compromised by staff turnover, record loss, and organizational fragmentation. By the 1970s, the company's knowledge of its own infrastructure was incomplete. Original as-built documentation for underground structures' vault layouts, drainage system routing, foundation details had been lost or was inaccessible. Burial records, while substantially intact, contained gaps and errors. The identity of specific vault ownership was sometimes uncertain. This knowledge loss had direct physical consequences. Without accurate maps of underground vault structures, surface maintenance activities risked causing subsidence or breakthrough into chambers. Without complete burial records, determining which structures required stabilization for heritage or family interest reasons was impossible. Without drainage system documentation, attempts to restore functionality were reduced to excavation-based discovery rather than planned repair. The informational deficit also prevented accurate assessment of the intervention scale required to arrest deterioration. External heritage consultants who visited the site in the early 1970s provided estimates of remediation costs that varied by factors of 3 to 5, depending on assumptions about the extent of hidden damage. Without invasive investigation test excavations, structural surveys, drainage system tracing, accurate cost estimation was impossible. But conducting such investigations required resources the company did not possess. The point of no return, defined by physical rather than financial criteria, occurred when deterioration had progressed to the stage where stabilization required capital expenditure exceeding the maximum plausible intervention that voluntary or charitable resources could provide. This threshold was crossed for different cemetery sections at different times. The West Cemetery's most deteriorated sections reached this threshold by the late 1960s. Some structures, particularly those that had experienced vandalism-related damage, flooding, and advanced vegetation encroachment simultaneously, had deteriorated beyond any feasible restoration and could only be stabilized as protected ruins. The stabilization threshold was not uniform across the site. Structures varied enormously in their deterioration state. Some monuments in well-drained locations with minimal vandalism showed only superficial weathering and could be preserved with modest intervention. Others, particularly underground structures in areas with failed drainage and vegetation penetration, had suffered comprehensive material failure requiring complete reconstruction if original configuration was to be restored. The economic challenge was that both types of structures existed intermixed across the site, making selective stabilization logistically complex and cost-inefficient. The mass balance of the system, the accounting of what was being lost versus what was being preserved, was unambiguously negative by the early 1970s. The rate of deterioration exceeded the rate of any preservation activity. The backlog of required interventions was growing. Each winter freeze-thaw cycle, each summer of unchecked vegetation growth, each vandalism incident, each season of deferred maintenance added to the accumulated damage. The system was in accelerating decline, and the physical trajectory was independent of financial or institutional considerations. The physics autopsy reveals that the failure chain was not initiated by a single causative event, but by the interaction of multiple coupled deterioration processes, each relatively benign in isolation, but catastrophic in combination. Vegetation growth is normal in landscapes. Water infiltration occurs in all buried structures. Vandalism happens. Material aging is universal. What made these processes catastrophic at Highgate was their simultaneous occurrence in the absence of any counteracting maintenance intervention, combined with the specific vulnerability characteristics of Victorian cemetery infrastructure. The feedback loop that made recovery increasingly difficult operated through both physical and economic mechanisms. Physically, each increment of deterioration created conditions accelerating subsequent deterioration. Economically, each increment of deterioration increased the cost of eventual remediation, moving the required intervention further beyond available resources. The loop was nonlinear. The relationship between time and total damage was not proportional but exponential. Early intervention would have been relatively inexpensive. Delayed intervention became progressively more expensive. By the time intervention finally occurred, The cost had increased by orders of magnitude compared to what would have been required if addressed promptly. The failure chain, reconstructed from physical evidence and fragmentary documentation, proceeded as follows. Plot saturation terminated sales revenue. Financial constraints forced maintenance reductions. Deferred maintenance allowed vegetation encroachment and drainage failure. Vegetation and water initiated structural damage to underground chambers. Structural damage created access points for vandalism. Vandalism accelerated damage and attracted media attention. Media attention highlighted deterioration without triggering adequate intervention. Absence of intervention allowed all deterioration mechanisms to continue unabated. Cumulative damage reached threshold, where stabilization cost exceeded any plausible funding source available within existing institutional framework. Each link in this chain was documented. The causal relationships were physically demonstrable. The progression was deterministic given the initial conditions and the absence of counteracting interventions. The failure was not mysterious or probabilistic. It was the inevitable outcome of coupled deterioration processes operating on infrastructure without adequate maintenance, governed by an institutional structure with no adaptive capacity and no external intervention mechanism. The false plant picture, the informational analog to technical system failures, was the belief, maintained by various stakeholders at various times, that the cemetery's deterioration represented manageable decline rather than irreversible failure. This belief was supported by selective observation of maintained areas, by management communications that minimized crisis severity, and by the absence of comprehensive condition assessment data. The reality was comprehensive failure across multiple coupled systems. The divergence between perceived condition and actual condition prevented timely intervention and allowed deterioration to progress to the point where only emergency preservation measures could prevent total loss. The transition from institutional failure to external intervention began not through planned policy, but through grassroots mobilization responding to media coverage of the cemetery's deterioration. In 1975, a group of local residents and heritage enthusiasts formed the Friends of Highgate Cemetery, a voluntary organization with the stated objective of preventing further vandalism and initiating preservation efforts. This formation represented the first organized external intervention in the cemetery's decline, but it also introduced a new set of operational challenges distinct from those that had caused the original failure. The Friends organization operated under severe constraints from its inception. It had no legal ownership of the cemetery property. It had no statutory authority to mandate actions or restrict access. It had no significant financial resources beyond member subscriptions and small donations. What it possessed was volunteer labor capacity and organizational structure sufficient to coordinate collective action. The initial activities focused on the most visible and tractable problems: clearing vegetation overgrowth from main pathways, removing accumulated debris, and organizing regular patrols to deter vandalism. These activities represented stabilization in the most limited sense, preventing further acceleration of decline rather than reversing existing damage. Vegetation clearing addressed the aesthetic manifestation of neglect, but did not remediate the structural damage that decades of root growth had already caused. Debris removal improved access, but did not repair collapsed structures. Volunteer patrols reduced new vandalism incidents, but could not restore elements already stolen or damaged. The gap between what volunteer action could accomplish and what comprehensive restoration required remained enormous. The Friends organization's formation also created a new informational and governance challenge. The London Cemetery Company still existed as a legal entity and retained ownership of the property. The company's relationship with the new volunteer organization was undefined by any formal agreement. The company lacked resources to maintain the site but also lacked legal mechanism to transfer responsibility to the volunteers. The volunteers could work on the site with the company's tacit permission, but they had no enforceable rights and no guarantee that their efforts would be sustained or protected. This ambiguous governance structure created operational inefficiencies. Decisions about which sections to prioritize, which structures to stabilize, and how to allocate limited resources required coordination between the volunteer organization and the company. But the two entities had different incentive structures and different information. The company's primary concern was minimizing legal liability and avoiding insolvency proceedings. The Friends organization's primary concern was preserving heritage value and preventing further physical loss. These objectives aligned in some areas but conflicted in others. The physical condition of the cemetery in 1975, when organized stabilization efforts began, represented the cumulative result of approximately 30 years of accelerating decline. A comprehensive condition survey conducted by volunteers with assistance from conservation professionals documented the extent of deterioration across different cemetery sections. The West Cemetery, being older and having experienced longer periods of deferred maintenance, showed the most severe damage. Approximately 60% of the West Cemetery area was classified as severely deteriorated with structures in collapse or immediate risk of collapse. 25% was classified as moderately deteriorated with significant damage, but structures still substantially intact. Only 15% retained condition approximating the original design intent. The East Cemetery, being newer and having received continued minimal maintenance longer, showed better overall condition but was trending towards similar deterioration. The survey identified specific high-priority structures requiring immediate stabilization to prevent irreversible loss. These included the Egyptian Avenue facade, multiple sections of the Circle of Lebanon catacombs, the terrace catacombs retaining walls, and several architecturally significant individual monuments and mausolea. The stabilization work that commenced in the late 1970s operated under physical and financial constraints that fundamentally shaped what could be achieved. The volunteer workforce, while dedicated, lacked specialized conservation skills. Stone masonry repair, structural engineering, drainage system reconstruction, and monument conservation all require specific technical expertise. The Friends organization could recruit volunteers for manual labor, vegetation clearing, debris removal, cleaning, but could not staff skilled conservation work through volunteers alone. Specialized work required paid professionals, which required funding. Funding acquisition became the organization's central challenge. Heritage preservation in Britain during the 1970s and 1980s operated through a fragmented funding landscape. English Heritage, the statutory body responsible for historic environment protection, provided grants for sites of national significance. Local authorities provided some funding for sites of regional importance. Charitable trusts and foundations supported specific conservation projects, but accessing these funding sources required navigating complex application processes, meeting specific eligibility criteria, and demonstrating project viability. Highgate's status was ambiguous within this funding framework. The cemetery was not a scheduled ancient monument. It was not in state ownership. The owning company was a private commercial entity in financial distress. The site's significance was recognized by conservation professionals, but had not been formally designated at the national level. These factors created obstacles to accessing major funding streams. Early grant applications were unsuccessful or generated only small amounts insufficient for comprehensive restoration. The stabilization strategy that emerged from these constraints was necessarily incremental and opportunistic. Projects were selected based on three criteria: heritage significance, structural urgency, and funding availability. Work proceeded in phases as resources allowed. The Egyptian Avenue facade received early attention because it was highly visible, architecturally significant, and had attracted specific donor interest. Stabilization involved vegetation removal, mortar repointing, structural reinforcement of displaced elements, and installation of drainage improvements to prevent further water infiltration. This work revealed a fundamental challenge that would characterize all subsequent stabilization efforts: the gap between apparent damage and hidden damage. Surface inspection of the Egyptian Avenue facade identified visible deterioration, vegetation growth, mortar loss, stone displacement. Physical intervention revealed far more extensive damage. Behind the visible facade, backing masonry had deteriorated severely. Structural elements assumed to be sound were found to be compromised. Drainage systems thought to be intact were completely failed. The actual scope of work required to achieve genuine stabilization exceeded initial estimates by factors of 2 to 3. This pattern repeated across multiple projects. Stabilization of the Circle of Lebanon catacombs required not just surface repairs, but comprehensive structural intervention, including root barrier installation, drainage system reconstruction, and in some cases, complete rebuilding of collapsed wall sections. The terrace catacombs' retaining walls, thought to require only repointing, were found to have lost structural integrity and required installation of internal reinforcement systems. Each discovery of hidden damage consumed resources, extended project timelines, and required additional fundraising. The question of what constituted stabilization versus restoration became central to project planning and fundraising. Stabilization aimed to arrest deterioration and prevent further loss, but not necessarily to restore original appearance or functionality. Restoration aimed to return structures to their original condition. The resource requirements differed by orders of magnitude. A collapsed vault could be stabilized by installing weatherproof covering and ensuring structural safety, preventing further deterioration while leaving the structure visibly damaged. Restoration would require complete reconstruction to original configuration, immensely more expensive and requiring specialized skills and materials. The Friends organization and its professional advisors generally adopted a stabilization-first approach, recognizing that comprehensive restoration of the entire cemetery was financially implausible. But this approach created tension with some stakeholders who viewed the cemetery's heritage value as dependent on restoration to original condition. Leaving structures visibly damaged, even if structurally stabilized, was seen by some as inadequate preservation. The organization navigated this tension by pursuing selective restoration of the most significant structures, while accepting stabilized ruin status for others. The secondary crisis that emerged during the stabilization phase was the discovery of the true extent of human remains disturbance. As vegetation was cleared and collapsed structures were accessed, the scale of burial integrity compromise became visible. In multiple underground chambers, coffins had failed and human skeletal remains were exposed or commingled. Some remains had been disturbed by vandalism. Others had been displaced by structural collapse. Still others had been disarticulated by water damage and biological decay processes. This discovery created both ethical and regulatory challenges. The remains were legally protected. Disturbance or removal required specific permissions under burial law. But many of the remains were in conditions that required intervention, exposed to weather, at risk of further damage, or in locations that required access for structural stabilization work. The Friends organization worked with local authorities and the Church of England to develop protocols for respectful handling, documentation, and, where necessary, reinterment or protective covering of disturbed remains. The process of addressing human remains issues revealed another layer of the institutional knowledge deficit. In many cases, the identity of individuals whose remains had been disturbed could not be determined. Burial records were incomplete or ambiguous. Vault ownership information was unclear. Some families could be traced and consulted, others could not. The organization developed decision protocols for cases where consultation was impossible, generally prioritizing dignified treatment and secure reinterment over attempts to restore original burial configuration, when that configuration could not be determined with certainty. The stabilization work also revealed ongoing deterioration processes that volunteer action could not address. Root systems continued to grow and cause structural damage even in areas where surface vegetation had been cleared. Drainage failures continued to cause water accumulation despite surface water management improvements. The fundamental problem that the infrastructure required continuous professional maintenance at levels beyond volunteer capacity remained unresolved. Stabilization slowed deterioration but did not arrest it. The cemetery remained in decline, albeit at a reduced rate. The financial model supporting stabilization efforts exhibited its own fragility. Volunteer organizations depend on sustained volunteer engagement, which fluctuates with organizational leadership, public interest, and perceived progress. Funding from grants and donations is episodic and unpredictable. Long-term financial planning was impossible. Projects had to be designed to fit available funding rather than funding being secured to address identified needs. This created inefficiencies. Work occurred in fragmented phases rather than coordinated campaigns. Mobilization costs were repeated across multiple small projects, and economies of scale were lost. By the early 1980s, approximately 5 years into organized stabilization efforts, the Friends organization had achieved measurable but limited success. The most visible deterioration had been addressed. Vandalism had decreased significantly due to regular volunteer presence and improved security. Several high-priority structures had been stabilized. Public awareness of the cemetery's heritage value had increased. But the fundamental structural and financial challenges remained. The cemetery still required professional maintenance at levels that volunteer capacity and episodic grant funding could not sustain indefinitely. The critical uncertainty during this period was whether the stabilization trajectory could be sustained. The volunteer organization had demonstrated that grassroots action could arrest the most acute deterioration, but could it prevent the cemetery from eventually reverting to decline if volunteer engagement waned, if grant funding dried up, or if a severe weather event caused damage beyond the organization's response capacity? The system had transitioned from uncontrolled collapse to managed precariousness. It was not yet stable in any self-sustaining sense. The governance question, how to transition from ambiguous volunteer operation of privately owned property to a legally secure, financially sustainable preservation model, remained unresolved. The London Cemetery Company still owned the site but had no operational capacity and limited legal incentive to transfer ownership. The Friends organization operated the site de facto but had no legal ownership and no guaranteed continuity. Various proposals for formal transfer of ownership to a charitable trust, to local government, or to a newly constituted entity were discussed but encountered legal and financial obstacles. The physical evidence from this period, photographic documentation, condition reports, project records, shows a site in transition. Areas that had received intervention looked markedly better than areas still awaiting attention, but even intervened areas showed continued slow deterioration. Stone that had been repointed in 1977 showed renewed mortar loss by 1982. Vegetation that had been cleared in 1978 had regrown significantly by 1983. Drainage improvements made in 1979 showed partial failure by 1984. The maintenance cycle required to sustain stabilization gains was continuous, and the organization's capacity to deliver that maintenance was uncertain. The stabilization attempts revealed a fundamental principle applicable to heritage infrastructure generally: preventing deterioration requires lower resource commitment than reversing deterioration, but both require continuous expenditure. The cemetery had deteriorated for 3 decades without intervention. Reversing that deterioration required intensive initial intervention plus sustained ongoing maintenance. The initial intervention had been partially achieved through volunteer mobilization and grant funding. The sustained maintenance component, the perpetual commitment of resources, had not been secured. The lessons emerging from this stabilization phase informed later heritage preservation policy but did not immediately resolve Highgate's situation. The experience demonstrated that volunteer action could achieve significant preservation outcomes but could not substitute for professional management and secure funding. It demonstrated that stabilization was achievable but required long-term institutional commitment beyond what episodic fundraising could provide. It demonstrated that governance structures mattered, that effective preservation required clear legal authority, enforceable management protocols, and alignment of responsibility with capability. What could not be known in the moment, what required later forensic analysis to confirm, was whether the stabilization trajectory initiated in 1975 would prove sustainable across decades, or would eventually stall, leaving the cemetery in a partially improved but still fundamentally precarious state. The physical infrastructure had been prevented from complete collapse, but had it been secured for genuine long-term preservation? That question could only be answered through continued observation across timescales measuring decades rather than years. The long-term trajectory of Highgate Cemetery's preservation, observable only from the perspective of decades following the initial stabilization efforts, provides the forensic evidence necessary to evaluate whether the intervention model achieved genuine sustainability or merely delayed inevitable failure. By the 1990s and 2000s, sufficient time had elapsed to assess the durability of stabilization work, the adequacy of governance structures, and the viability of the financial model supporting ongoing operations. The physical evidence from comprehensive condition surveys conducted in 1995 and 2005 revealed patterns consistent with theoretical predictions about maintenance-dependent infrastructure. Structures that had received professional conservation treatment in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and that had subsequently received regular inspection and preventive maintenance, remained in stable condition. Surface treatments applied 20 years earlier showed weathering but not failure. Structural interventions, reinforcement, drainage improvements, root barriers continued to function as designed. These structures demonstrated that appropriate intervention, when followed by sustained maintenance, could arrest deterioration indefinitely. Conversely, structures that had received initial stabilization but had not received subsequent regular maintenance showed renewed deterioration. The pattern was not uniform but was statistically significant across multiple structure types. Stone masonry that had been repointed in the early 1980s showed mortar loss and vegetation recolonization by the mid-1990s in sections where inspection and maintenance had lapsed. Drainage systems installed in the late 1970s showed blockage and reduced function by the late 1990s, where clearing maintenance had not occurred on regular cycles. The physical evidence confirmed the theoretical principle: stabilization is not a permanent state but a trajectory requiring continuous resource commitment. The critical governance transformation that enabled transition from precarious volunteer operation to sustainable institutional management occurred in 1981, when the London Cemetery Company formally transferred ownership of the cemetery to a newly established charitable trust, the Cemetery of St. James Highgate. This transfer resolved the legal ambiguity that had constrained earlier preservation efforts. The charitable trust had clear legal ownership, statutory authority to manage the site, and organizational structure designed explicitly for heritage preservation rather than commercial profit. The transfer itself was legally complex, requiring navigation of company law, charity law, burial law, and property law. The cemetery company's insolvency status created obstacles. Creditors potentially had claims against the property as an asset. The resolution involved demonstrating that the property had negative economic value when liabilities, perpetual maintenance obligations, were properly accounted against assets, land, and structures requiring expensive upkeep. Once this negative value was established, creditor claims were satisfied through negotiated settlements, and the property could be transferred to the charitable trust without triggering additional financial obligations. The charitable trust's establishment changed the funding landscape. As a registered charity with clear heritage preservation mission, the organization became eligible for grant funding sources previously inaccessible. English Heritage, the Heritage Lottery Fund, local authority heritage funding, and charitable foundations all provided grants for specific conservation projects throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Cumulatively, these grants funded millions of pounds worth of conservation work, an order of magnitude beyond what volunteer fundraising alone could have achieved. The organizational structure adopted by the trust incorporated lessons from the earlier volunteer phase. Professional staff were employed for specialized functions: site management, conservation planning, visitor services, while volunteer contributions were focused on areas where non-specialist labor was appropriate. This division of labor proved more efficient than the earlier model where volunteers attempted to perform all functions regardless of skill match. Volunteers continued to provide essential capacity for grounds maintenance, guided tours, and administrative support, but skilled conservation work was contracted to qualified professionals. The financial model evolved toward a hybrid structure combining multiple revenue streams. Visitor admission fees, introduced in the 1980s, provided baseline operating income. The cemetery transitioned from freely accessible public space to managed heritage site with controlled access and charged admission. This change was controversial. Burial grounds traditionally maintained public access, but was justified as necessary for both revenue generation and site protection. Uncontrolled access had contributed to vandalism and damage in earlier decades. Managed access with trained guides reduced these risks while generating income. Grant funding provided capital for major conservation projects, but was episodic and could not be relied upon for ongoing operational costs. Membership programs and charitable donations supplemented admission income. Commercial activities, photography permits, filming location fees, event hosting generated additional revenue. Educational programs for schools created both mission-aligned activity and modest income. No single revenue stream was sufficient, but the diversified portfolio collectively generated operating income approaching the level required for professional site management. The question of financial sustainability, whether the trust's income model could support perpetual maintenance obligations without reverting to the deferred maintenance trajectory that caused the original failure-required multi-decade assessment. Financial records from the trust's operations between 1981 and 2010 showed operating budgets generally balanced or achieving modest surplus. Major conservation projects were grant-funded as discrete campaigns. Routine maintenance was funded from operating income. The model appeared sustainable under normal conditions, but remained vulnerable to scenarios where operating income declined, reduced visitor numbers, economic recession affecting donations, or major unforeseen capital costs arose, severe storm damage, structural failures requiring emergency intervention. The preservation work conducted under the trust's management included both completion of stabilization work begun in the volunteer phase and new conservation initiatives addressing previously untouched areas. The Egyptian Avenue underwent comprehensive restoration in the late 1980s, transitioning from stabilized condition to fully restored condition approaching original appearance. The Circle of Lebanon received phased conservation treatment through the 1990s and early 2000s, with each catacomb section undergoing structural stabilization, drainage improvement, and careful management of the tree structure interaction. The techniques employed in these conservation projects reflected evolving best practices in heritage conservation. Early stabilization work in the 1970s had sometimes employed inappropriate materials, modern cement mortars incompatible with historic masonry, impermeable coatings that trapped moisture, structural interventions that altered original character. By the 1990s, conservation professionals had developed more sophisticated approaches. Lime-based mortars matching original composition, breathable surface treatments, reversible structural interventions, and careful documentation of all work to inform future conservation efforts. The treatment of underground structures, vaults, and catacombs required balancing multiple objectives that were sometimes in tension. Preservation required preventing further structural deterioration and protecting burial contents. Public safety required ensuring that accessible structures were structurally sound. Dignity and respect for the deceased required minimizing disturbance of human remains. Heritage interpretation required maintaining legibility of the cemetery's historical and architectural significance. Access for descendants required accommodating family visits to ancestral graves, where these could be arranged safely. In practice, this balance was achieved through zoning and differential access management. Some underground structures were comprehensively stabilized and made accessible for guided tours, allowing public engagement with the cemetery's unique architectural features, while ensuring safety through controlled access and regular structural monitoring. Other structures were stabilized but sealed, protecting burial contents while preventing public access that could compromise remains or create safety risks. Still others, too damaged for safe access or containing disturbed remains requiring protection, were stabilized externally and sealed permanently, preserved as closed chambers with exterior-only conservation. The physical condition of the cemetery by 2010, approximately 35 years after organized preservation began, and 30 years after formal charitable trust ownership, demonstrated that sustained institutional commitment could achieve long-term stabilization of complex heritage infrastructure. Aerial photography and systematic condition monitoring showed that vegetation was managed, structures were maintained, deterioration was arrested in areas receiving regular attention, and the site functioned simultaneously as a working cemetery, heritage attraction, and nature conservation area. However, the same condition monitoring revealed ongoing challenges. Portions of the cemetery, particularly in the West Cemetery's most densely vegetated and structurally complex areas, remained in conditions approximating the deteriorated state of the 1970s. Resource constraints meant that conservation work had focused on accessible, high-priority, and fundable projects. Areas of lower architectural significance, difficult physical access, or uncertain structural condition had received minimal intervention beyond essential vegetation management. The cemetery exhibited spatial heterogeneity, sections in excellent conserved condition adjacent to sections showing continued deterioration. This spatial heterogeneity reflected the economic reality that even with improved governance and sustainable funding, resources remained constrained relative to the total preservation requirement. The cemetery contained hundreds of individual structures, vaults, monuments, mausolea, each requiring periodic maintenance. Comprehensive preservation of every structure to museum-quality standards would require capital investment and ongoing maintenance budgets beyond any plausible funding scenario. The Trust's management strategy therefore involved explicit prioritization, accepting that not everything could be preserved equally, and focusing resources on elements of greatest significance, while managing other areas to prevent catastrophic loss without attempting comprehensive restoration. The lessons extracted from Highgate's trajectory informed broader heritage preservation policy and practice in Britain and internationally. The case demonstrated that private ownership of heritage infrastructure created vulnerabilities when commercial viability declined. It validated the principle that heritage assets with public significance required public or charitable stewardship rather than private commercial operation. It showed that volunteer action could catalyze preservation but could not substitute for professional management and secure funding. It confirmed that prevention was cheaper than cure. The deferred maintenance created nonlinear cost escalation that made delayed intervention immensely more expensive than timely maintenance. These lessons influenced regulatory frameworks governing burial grounds, heritage sites, and charitable trusts. The Burials Act amendments in the 1980s and later legislation created clearer mechanisms for transferring failing cemetery companies to charitable or public ownership. English heritage and successor bodies developed funding programs specifically addressing heritage at risk, recognizing that without proactive intervention, economically marginal heritage assets faced inevitable loss. Professional conservation standards evolved to incorporate long-term maintenance planning and sustainability assessment into project design, rather than treating conservation as one-time intervention. The Highgate case also demonstrated limitations of heritage preservation models dependent on visitor income. The cemetery's preservation was enabled partly by its proximity to London and its distinctive Gothic character, which attracted tourists and generated admission revenue. Many burial grounds of equal historical significance, but in less accessible locations or with less dramatic aesthetic appeal, could not replicate this model. The broader policy implication was that heritage preservation required public funding commitment, not reliance on self-generated revenue that only economically favorable sites could achieve. From an institutional design perspective, the case illustrated the hazards of creating perpetual obligations without perpetual funding mechanisms. The Victorian cemetery companies assumed their commercial model would sustain operations indefinitely, an assumption that proved false. The lesson was not that perpetual obligations should be avoided, but that they required governance structures and funding models explicitly designed for indefinite duration. Charitable trusts with endowments, public ownership with dedicated budgets, or hybrid models combining multiple revenue sources were more robust than commercial models dependent on market conditions. The forensic conclusion, examining the complete arc from design in the 1830s through failure in mid-20th century to stabilization and sustainable management by the early 21st century, was that the original failure was structurally determined by the economic model, but that recovery was institutionally determined by governance transformation. The physical infrastructure was never the fundamental problem. Victorian cemetery construction was robust. Structures built in the 1840s remained substantially intact in the 2010s where maintenance had been provided. The failure was not engineering but economics and institutional design. The system did not fail because humans were careless or incompetent. The London Cemetery Company's operators made rational decisions given the constraints they faced. Families who ceased paying maintenance fees acted rationally given weakening emotional connections and absent enforcement. Regulators who did not intervene acted within their legal mandates. The failure occurred because the system was designed with assumptions that became invalid under predictable social and economic evolution, and the institutional structure provided no mechanism to adapt when those assumptions failed. The recovery did not occur because new technology or techniques became available. The conservation methods used in the 1980s and 1990s were not fundamentally different from what could have been employed in the 1950s or 1960s. Recovery occurred because institutional transformation transferred to charitable ownership, access to public and philanthropic funding, professional management structure created an organizational entity capable of sustaining preservation activity indefinitely. The technical work was important, but the enabling factor was institutional redesign. The contradiction introduced in the opening forensic analysis is resolved by recognizing that the cemetery was designed correctly for the conditions its designers understood, but those conditions were not perpetual. The design assumed stable demand, enforceable fees, and modest costs. It assumed commercial viability would persist indefinitely. These assumptions were reasonable in 1839. They became invalid by the mid-20th century due to societal changes the designers could not have anticipated: cremation adoption, suburbanization, inflation, changing cultural attitudes toward death and memorialization. The information structure that enabled the wrong decisions to appear plausible was the fragmentation of knowledge among stakeholders who each understood their portion of the system, but not the system as a whole. Company management understood financial constraints, but not heritage conservation requirements. Heritage advocates understood architectural significance, but not legal and financial realities of cemetery operation. Families understood their emotional connection to specific graves, but not the systemic challenges of site-wide maintenance. Regulators understood statutory frameworks, but not the practical consequences of regulatory gaps. No single entity integrated this distributed knowledge into comprehensive system understanding until crisis forced creation of new institutional structures specifically designed for that integration. The final physical state of Highgate Cemetery, observable in the second decade of the 21st century, represents not restoration to original condition, but stabilization at a new equilibrium. The site functions as a managed heritage landscape, maintained to standards that prevent deterioration while accepting that complete restoration is neither financially feasible nor, arguably, desirable. The cemetery's value includes both its Victorian design intent and its 20th century history of decline and recovery. The vegetation that once threatened structures is now managed to balance ecological value with preservation requirements. The cemetery is simultaneously a burial ground, a heritage site, a nature reserve, and an educational resource, a multifunctional landscape that could not have been anticipated by its Victorian designers, but that represents sustainable adaptation to contemporary conditions. The systemic lessons extend beyond cemetery management to any infrastructure designed for perpetual operation. Hospitals, schools, transportation systems, water supply infrastructure, and other public goods share the characteristic that operational requirements are indefinite, but funding mechanisms are contingent on political, economic, and social conditions that change over time. The Highgate case demonstrates that perpetual infrastructure requires institutional structures explicitly designed for adaptation, diversified funding resistant to single-point failure, and governance frameworks that integrate long-term stewardship obligations with short-term operational realities. The cemetery continues to operate, to bury the dead, to host visitors, to preserve heritage, and to function as designed, though the design has been reinterpreted, and the institution sustaining it bears no resemblance to the commercial company that created it. The physical infrastructure persists because institutional transformation created organizational capacity for sustained maintenance. The transformation was not spontaneous. It required crisis to motivate action, dedicated individuals to initiate intervention, legal innovation to enable ownership transfer, public and philanthropic funding to resource preservation, and professional management to sustain operations across decades. The dark story of Highgate Cemetery is not supernatural mythology, but the forensic reality of infrastructure failure when economic models underlying physical systems become obsolete and institutional structures lack adaptive capacity. The resolution demonstrates that such failures, while structurally determined by design assumptions, are not irreversible. Institutional innovation, adequately resourced and professionally managed, can stabilize even comprehensively failed systems. But the cost of delayed intervention measured in decades of deterioration, irreversible heritage loss, and resources required for recovery vastly exceeds the cost that timely maintenance would have required. The systemic lesson is universal. Infrastructure designed for perpetuity requires institutions designed for adaptation, and the cost of institutional failure is always paid, whether through maintenance or through recovery.